All right, my clock says it is 6 o'clock, so let's get started. Hi, my name is Dr. Basil Considine. I am here from the ACU Online Writing Center for our webinar, Theoretical and Conceptual Frameworks. This meeting is being recorded, and we'll have a copy of that sent to everyone who RSVP'd for this. If you did not RSVP for the webinar and you would still like a copy of that emailed directly to you, just type your email address in the chat room, either public or private message, and I will send it to you when we're done with this meeting. That will probably get posted at 30-40 minutes after we wrap up. So while our Zoom permissions don't normally allow attendees to record, we do record these automatically, and happy to send that to anyone who wants it. And these always get posted to the Writing Center website as well. We are a little bit into the term, so I'll just go through a little bit of this information for people who might be new to the Writing Center or have not used all of our services before. The ACU Online Writing Center serves just about every student who attends the ACU Online or ACU Dallas campus, the only exception being students from our Graduate School of Theology, which is what I call the God exception. It's in a particular place. You can work with us through webinars such as this. You can send us emails. You can sign up for different types of appointments. Our default appointment, the appointments that most students take, are what we call asynchronous appointments. In an asynchronous appointment, you upload a copy of your draft, perhaps give us a couple questions or special requests, and then within 24 hours, we send you feedback via email. Now, sometimes you have just a set of questions where you'd really like to talk with someone in person in real time, and that's fine. Just when you make your appointment, put in the note saying that you are requesting a real-time appointment, and we'll see what we can do to accommodate that. Of course, if you are in another time zone, it might be helpful to send us a list of potential times so we can line that up. But in general, we try and accommodate those whenever we can. We also have a growing body of sample papers and blog posts and special topics and other resources on our Writing Center website. As the head of doctoral writing support here at ACU, I also maintain our APA course paper templates and the EDD dissertation and DMP project templates that you use for the essentially the miniature study that you write at the conclusion of your program. If you are in one of our other graduate programs and you are wondering what can you use for your final project, if you have one, most students will just use a slightly modified version of our APA course paper template for that. And of course, since we moved to APA 7 this term, if you have questions about that, we have not only a whole detailed APA 7 webinar on the website, but also special resources, and we take questions via email. Some things that we have coming up in the pipeline. My colleague, Julie Johnson, is teaching our Writing a Case Study Analysis webinar tomorrow. Then we have Avoiding Plagiarism in APA 7. So that combines the general how you should be marking and attributing sources with some notes on how to specifically to do that in APA 7. And then we have Writing an Annotated Bibliography coming up next Thursday. And then 2 Tuesdays from now, on the 26th, I am teaching a workshop called Introduction to Grant Writing. Now, if you are near the start of a doctoral program, or you're looking at your work in your master's program and how that might continue, and you're thinking, you know, this is something I'd like to spend some time on, and it would be really great if someone else would pay me to work on this, you should come to that workshop. I have worked in higher education for a long time. I've applied to many grants, learned a few things about those, and I can say it is always easier and happier to do research when someone else is paying for it. I have gone to places that I would otherwise not be able to afford. I've gone to conferences. I've gotten grants. I've done projects that otherwise I would have said, well, maybe I'll do this other thing. But with money on the table, happy to do that. And there may be other things like that. If you are a first-year student and you're just working through the assignments, we're saying, what are your potential topics? What kinds of things interest you? It's good to look ahead and see what grants in 2 or 3 years you might want to be applying for, because if you look at the prerequisites and say, oh, they really want to see this, you can shape your assignments towards that goal. A couple other things, I just put this slide up to let you know that these are out there and resources that are available to you. And let's get to our main objectives for today. So we are going to explore two related but separate things, theoretical and conceptual frameworks, with the goal of understanding how expectations for these come up in the dissertation writing section. If you've just joined us, don't worry. We've just finished the preliminaries and we're talking about the main content of this webinar. Plus, we will be posting a recording of this to the Writing Center website later tonight. So if you need to catch that introductory stuff, you'll be able to catch it on recording. So there are a couple examples that I'm going to be using today. I can shape which examples I spend more time on based on who's here and what you're interested in. So if you are just joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat room. Let us know where you're joining us from geographically and what program you're in and where you are in the program, such as second term EDD, fourth term DNP, MFT, first term, whatever it should be. And that helps me know what examples I should spend more time on because they're more interesting and relevant to them. Right now, I'm going to start by looking at some stuff that's taken from the Leadership 1791 Dissertation Prospectus course. If you're not familiar with the dissertation prospectuses, don't worry. The dissertation is a terminal project used for many, but not all, doctoral programs. I wrote a doctoral dissertation for my PhD. I wrote a musical and military history of the island of Mauritius in the southern Indian Ocean, which is a very beautiful tropical island that makes Hawaii or Tahiti look plain, and also happened to have a lovely history involving pirates and opera singers, and a few other things involved there. Now, my dissertation was, if I recall correctly, 5 chapters. There's taking a chronological approach through things. It was a combined humanities and social science dissertation. Here at ACU, our doctoral programs, the EDD and the DNP, follow a standardized social science format, which is a 5-chapter structure, and there's specific expectations about what you'll do in each chapter. And essentially, the prospectus is a partial draft of chapters 1 and 2 that says, okay, here's this issue. I've identified a general problem, a specific problem. Here's a little bit of background. Here's some stuff you should know. Here's how I'm approaching this. Here's what I propose to do. And here's what people know already about this from the literature. And the conceptual framework, or the theoretical framework as the case may be, comes up as one of the things that you need to have in that section. And because it's something that you need to have in the dissertation prospectus, and if you're in the DMP program, in your DMP project prospectus, because it's something you have to write anyway, there are several assignments that will have you working on different versions of the prospectus over time. If you would like to see what one of these sections looks like in a finished dissertation, you absolutely can look at them. We have the ACU Digital Commons, which has recent dissertations, theses, and doctoral projects posted on it. So you can see what someone who graduated this year, possibly someone with your same advisor and committee, and see what they wrote and what was approved there. If you're looking for something where you'd like a model that's not necessarily at ACU, perhaps you're working on a particular area of interest and you want to see what does something like this look like for someone who's really working on what I'm doing, you have access to the ProQuest Theses and Dissertations database. This is an international database of theses and dissertations and doctoral projects from across the world, mostly English language, but I think most of you are probably working primarily with English language sources anyway. So those are all available. You have free access through ACU, and With that, let's look at some of what the EDD dissertation content guide has to say. Begin the introduction section with an overview of the general topic to establish context and orient the reader to the field of study. Include a brief background of the topic to give the reader the context of the problem. Next, connect the general topic to the specific research, theory, or conceptual framework that directly bears on the dissertation study. Use relevant, current, and seminal peer-reviewed articles and scholarly textbook citations to support the introduction, background, and theory of the conceptual framework. Now, I've added this bolding here, and we're going to come to that section in a moment, but let's break down what this is saying. Begin the introduction section with an overview of the general content, the general topic. Okay, so that tells me that the very first thing you should do is having some description of what you're exploring before we get to the specific problem that you're going to address. Paint us a general picture, then point out the bit that you are going to be examining. This should be brief, so not 10 pages. Probably 2 or 3 pages will be more than enough. Next, connect the general topic to the specific research theory or conceptual framework that directly bears on this. So what that's saying is, before you do anything else, tell the reader how you are looking at things. I would make the analogy of selecting some glasses. What are you going to be looking at? Well, if I'm going to be looking at the moon, I'm going to get a telescope. If I'm going to be looking at a small insect on a flower, I'm getting my magnifying glass out. If I'm just walking around and I want to see things in a mix of up close and intermediate, then I want my eyeglasses. If I'm just reading glasses. So you want to tell the reader how you're going to be looking at things. And that's going to use some combination of ideas or theories or concepts that you're putting together. So what is a theoretical or conceptual framework exactly? Well, first of all, you can understand these as ways of using prior scholarship and ideas to structure and guide your work. You can also look at these as philosophical and methodological guides to what you are perceiving as important to the study. For example, if you go to buy a car and the salesman says, red cars, the people who buy red cars are insert something. You might say, well, why is this important? Now, if the salesman were to say, red cars have lower insurance rates, or higher insurance rates as the case may be, and say, oh, well, that seems like something that might influence how I pick things. I don't want to pay more for my insurance. I'm not going to test drive one of the red cars. So it shapes how you look at things. And very importantly, it's a means of situating your work within prior scholarship, which I will say is very important, not just because you're supposed to be doing this kind of writing, but situating your work in relation to prior scholarship allows you to avoid recreating the wheel. You can do so much less writing when you've acknowledged, oh, this idea came from this person. They've done this argument to support it. I don't have to do it now. So how are theoretical and conceptual frameworks different? Well, you could read a whole article about this because there are a few, including this one here. And some people will say it's largely the same. Well, I can tell you the way that we use them here at ACU and with most of my faculty colleagues at other institutions, it's a way of approaching how much this idea has become concretized over time. Because there are ways that you can take an idea and refine it and clarify it, test it, evaluate it to produce something that we call a theory. And there are also things that that haven't reached that stage or haven't been used in that way for what you are doing, or that you are applying to an entirely new context where it wouldn't really be fair to call that a theory for what you're doing. So we're treating it as a concept or part of our conceptual framework. So a theoretical framework outlines a theory or theories, usually no more than 2 or 3, that support your research. A conceptual framework, by contrast, usually involves a less formally articulated concept or an idea or approach developed for something else that you're applying for this in a new context. So you might have a model of leadership that is used to, or was developed to inform people doing human resources training. How do we prepare this person to be a good manager? How do we prepare them to be an executive? You take that and say, well, if we were to extend this to this other thing, I think we're going to get these results. And so because you're taking that model and applying it in this new situation, you'd be using it as a conceptual framework. Now, if you had a theory of leadership that said, let's call this the theory of derived leadership that says that certain traits will lead to everything else, well, that's already a theory, so we can use that as our theoretical framework, or perhaps combine it with another one. But if we're really creating something new and different from it, or combining it with the model, we'd class that under conceptual framework. So there are a couple ways that you can look at what you're planning on using and say, well, is this going to be a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework? If there's only 1 or 2 theories involved, it's probably going to be a theoretical framework. If there are 3 or more, it's probably going to be a conceptual framework, just because you're trying to do something new through this combination. Occasionally you'll find someone who said, well, they're all theories, I'm going to call that a theoretical framework, but most of our faculty will say, yeah, I think that's a conceptual framework. If you're using models, concepts, or principles, or some combination, conceptual framework side of things. What you should not do is have both, because I have worked with a couple of students who read it and said, oh, I need to have a separate theoretical framework and a separate conceptual framework. And I'll tell you, their literature review section was very long and most of it unnecessary. So you only need 1 theoretical framework, however many parts you put together for that. Or rather than the theoretical framework, you can have a conceptual framework with however many parts you use to put that together. So there are some things that you should know about this, again, to avoid your doing unnecessary writing. In the EDD dissertation content guide, it specifically says, do not define theories and conceptual frameworks in your definition section. There's supposed to be in chapter 1 and in your prospectus, there's supposed to be a whole dedicated area for describing either your theoretical framework or your conceptual framework. So don't put anything in the definitions section. It would just have to be deleted anyway. Now, there is in the EDD dissertation content guide, there's an instruction about chapter 2 that I want to call your attention to. This is what I call an instruction worded as a suggestion. You may want to begin with a first topic as a detailed discussion of the study's theoretical framework. Read theoretical framework as theoretical or conceptual framework. It says you may want to begin. Every professor I've talked to here has said, begin your lit review with the discussion of your theoretical or conceptual framework. I am located here in the upper Midwest, where we have a habit of what other people with some frustration call passive-aggressive communication, where people don't necessarily say exactly what they mean and let you fill in the lines. I'm here to tell you, read this as you should begin your first subtopic in your lit review chapter with a detailed discussion of the theoretical framework. There's a similar instruction here about the conceptual framework. I'm going to call your attention to the slide and then move on and see where we are on time, because I don't know about you, I would like to look at some examples before we delve into this slide here. So I mentioned earlier that this is drawing on the actual course documents from the EDD 781 class. So I'm going to back up and I'm going to open up that course and I'm going to show you some of the things that we're talking about. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides here and I'm going to share my web browser. Just a moment as we get that up and running. Okay, now you should be able to see my web browser here, and you see I have the Leadership 7 in 91 course up here. If you're wondering, how do I get that dissertation content guide? Well, when you get to that point when you're taking this class, that's available for a download. If you need a copy of it earlier or want a copy of it earlier, usually if you just ask your professor, they'll send you one happily. And if they can't help you, we can send you one. So let's go ahead and look at some of these things here. So I'm going to open up the content guide here, and it downloads as a Word document here. So I'm going to change my share over to that. Do let me know if you can't see my screen in Word here. Don't worry about the abstract. You write that after you've got things up. And what this does is it walks you through some basic expectations and how you should write different sections. And we are heading down to the framework. But note what comes first. There is the problem statement, then the purpose statement, then your research questions, definitions of key terms. So where does that conceptual framework go? Well, if you're wondering why you haven't seen a section here, that's because the detailed discussion of the conceptual framework goes in chapter 2 in the literature review. You can certainly have a brief section here, but it's usually just a short couple sentences or a paragraph. Some people will fold into the purpose of the study and say, I am using this framework because it is helpful for doing these things that I want. So where would the lit review this go? Well, here are those instructions we're talking about. So the basic order for your lit review section would be 1 or 2 paragraphs, introduction to your study. This is for the people who flipped just to that chapter. Then 1 or 2 paragraphs on your literature search methods. And then your conceptual or theoretical framework, where you have a statement, okay, this is what I'm using. And then you discuss the literature about it to explain why you're using it and how it influences how you're going to review and interpret all the literature that you discuss in the next section, which is very important because you'll see here that the lit review chapter could be 30 to 60 pages in length. And your choice of a theoretical or conceptual framework can explain why you are not discussing some things, because the framework doesn't prioritize those or de-emphasizes them in favor of other things. So one of the other links that I showed you was a link to the ACU Digital Commons. And that we're going to go back to my web browser here. So you should now be seeing the ACU Digital Commons open on my web browser. It's just digitalcommons.acu.edu. And then you can see some little stats about what's been posted recently. But we're actually going to go ahead and look and see, oh, theses and dissertations from 2020. Sorry, seems to be an issue with the share. Just a moment. All right, let me know if you're not able to see my web browser. So we see here that there is a variety of theses and dissertations from the university. And what I suggest is that people go ahead and look for something that's related to what they're trying to do. Now, there are different degrees of related here. But let's just say that if you are in our education leadership program, you're probably going to want to be looking mostly at EDD stuff. So if we see, all right, this one looks like it's probably more on the DMP side. This one looks like it's either an MED or an EDD. So let's take a look here. This is all freely available to download. And if we scroll down here, we see, yes, it is an EDD. You can even see who is on the committee here and read the abstract. Now, the abstract often, but not always, tells you what the theoretical conceptual framework is. You'll see here that they say, oh, they were using the Bamberg model. So I bet that is part of their framework. Let's take a look. You can just download this as a PDF, no charge, no need to log in or anything. And if we scroll down here, let's head over to that table of contents. You see that they do in fact have a theoretical framework section. Now, this particular student has chosen to locate it near the end of the Lit Review chapter. I recommend having it near the start because it can save you a lot of extra work. If you put it at the end, your reader kind of has to go back and look at the stuff before, and that's often frustrating to the reader and frustrating to the committee. So in general, I would say put that section at the start of chapter 2 rather than at the end, but you will see a variety here. Let's go take a look and see what they have written there. Okay, so they are using transformational leadership, which explains why they picked that particular model, because it aligns with transformational leadership very well. And you'll see that they're discussing some related concepts and various literature. And all told, their main framework section has about 2 pages. And then they're also talking about using critical race theory. So this author has chosen to take 2 theories and combine them into their theoretical framework. That's fine. Again, I would have put it earlier, but you'll see a variety. And one of the truisms about writing in general is that there are many ways to do it. All right, let's look for another example here. This looks like it could be DMP or ADD. Let's take a peek. Nope, that is social work. Not to say that they wouldn't have it or couldn't have it, but we're looking for something related to the people here. Let's take a look at this one. Okay, this is an EDD educational leadership dissertation. Great. Oh yes, I remember working with a student. All right, so they do not explicitly mention their framework here. Let's go ahead and look at the document itself. See, this student used critical race theory for their theoretical framework. And you can see they have that right near the start of their Lit Review chapter, which is, again, something I recommend because it helps your reader navigate the rest of the things that you're discussing and explain why you emphasize some details and do not spend a lot of time writing about the others. Briefly, you'll see that they have chosen to thematically divide their discussion of the theoretical framework into a couple different sections. So while you might look at this and say, oh, that's just one page, they're discussing critical race theory in these 4 sections. So it turns out to be somewhere around 4 or 5 pages, which for this particular topic seems very appropriate. Go ahead and take a look at that. So they begin by introducing the theory, some key bits, some history of its evolution, boil down to 5 tenets, and then a section devoted to applying this and how it shapes, as you can read here, perceptions, assumptions, and beliefs. And then we have a new section where they're applying it, especially to schools and teachers, which from their title appears to be a major focus. So they have given us in these different sections a progressive argument showing why and how this is relevant, and chosen to divide this into subsections for extra clarity. That's fine. Works very well, easy to follow. Let's head back to our slides now. Here we are. So what are you trying to tell your reader in your theoretical or conceptual framework section? Well, you're essentially telling them, this is how I am looking at what I'm doing, how I go through the literature, how I've decided what things were important to pay attention to in my data gathering, whatever type of gathering that should be, and how I interpret the things that I found. So you might be running a survey and the survey instrument has been written by someone else. But when you're looking at the numbers and saying, okay, so we've got a statistical association with this thing, or my participants kept on saying this thing in an interview, the framework helps you decide what that means. It helps you interpret the results that you get. So let's break that down into a couple subpoints. Your framework determines what you pay attention to and focus on within the larger or general problem under study. Anything that you choose to explore will very likely be a small part of a much larger thing. You can be addressing an issue at a school or at a district, and then there's the larger state in the nation, and you might work on that later in your career, but do the one with the school or the district first so you can graduate on time. So while there may be more aspects of the problem that need to be explored and will be explored by someone, possibly you, the theoretical conceptual framework helps explain why you have chosen to focus on a smaller subsection of that. And it also guides the methodology that you select for addressing the problem under study. Question to those in the audience today. What is an area of interest, area of research that interests you? What is something that you like reading the literature about, or that you are considering doing your own dissertation or doctoral study research on? You can type that in the chat window. That'll just help me customize some of these examples with things more relevant to you. But what kinds of things the framework says are important will guide how you go about collecting data, what kinds of data. As an example, when I was doing my dissertation research, one of the operative rules that I was using can be summarized as follow the money. It says, someone who is paying for something must think it is important. Find out who is paying for something, and we find out who thinks it's important enough to pay that money. And so I did a lot of tracing and things, finding, oh, this part of the government was paying for that. This private individual was paying for that. When you're dealing with pirates who have retired with a lot of treasure, I found it especially interesting what they were paying for, because they had just about anything they could want. So why were they retiring? What were they choosing to spend money on that they couldn't get doing the normal pirate stuff? So based on the framework that I chose there, emphasizing this money flow, I was able to say, okay, so let's see what we can find for evidence of what they spent their money on, what they cared about. And that led me to some insights about what they were doing and how they'd been convinced to retire. Now, when you pick the primary research questions that you ask, we'll come back to the primary part in a moment. You pick the primary research questions that you're trying to answer. They should be things that the theoretical or conceptual framework highlights as being important. So if the theory you've chosen does not emphasize and says, this other thing is not nearly as important as that, you probably shouldn't be using that excluded thing in your primary research questions because it would give you poor alignment between the framework and the rest of the study. On the other hand, and if your research question is, let's take an education example here. If you have chosen in Maslow's hierarchy of needs for your exploration of why do students from this background do that thing, then per the hierarchy of needs, there are certain fundamental things that need to be taken in care of before people will focus or care about things that are lower on the hierarchy. And thus, your research questions would have to do with things like, is this being met? Or why isn't this being met? And then once you have the research questions set, then you can see, okay, well, how best to answer that? Is this something where I need to collect quantitative data and perhaps I'm going to use a survey? Is this qualitative where I just need to sit people down and interview them and see what they say, what they all agree on, or what comes up a lot? So by establishing your framework earlier, sooner rather than later, it helps you pick these other things. I'm not saying that you can't decide on your framework at a later point after you've written these things, but you most likely have to do a bit of rewriting to get them to fit. And that's work that if you don't have to do it, I'd say don't. We all want to graduate sooner rather than later. Now, the next couple things that we do here usually focus on exploring different examples, and how far we go into them, how much we discuss them is up to the people in the room. So if you are feeling, this is great, but I do have a paper that's due this weekend that I'd love to go to now, don't let me stop you. If you'd like to hear more about a specific topic or to delve into some of those dissertation examples, great, let me know and we'll go from there. I'm going to go back to my web browser now, and we're going to go into some additional detail about those examples we were viewing. All right, so we are back at the digital commons here. And let's go ahead and we're going to look at a D&P dissertation, a D&P project. So this is for our Doctor of Nursing Practice program. And they identify a problem. The abstract doesn't tell us what their framework was. So let's go ahead and let's take a peek at the document itself. Now, I always like to start at the table of contents because that gives you a good bird's eye view of what was done in what order. And we'll see here, this student has chosen to situate their conceptual framework section in the introduction, which is fine. That's not uncommon. And they are in the D&P program, not in the EDD program, so we have no conflict with the planning document. Before we get there, let's look and see what their research question is, their primary research question, which is, how do nurse-to-patient ratios in the emergency department impact patient experience? Okay, so we'll keep that in mind as we go look at their conceptual framework. So they have chosen Donabedian's triad for quality assessment. Triad meaning there's three things. And those three things happen to be structure, process, and outcome. These three criteria for evaluating the quality of medical care that you're getting. So, all right. If we look back at that research question of how do nurse-to-patient ratios in the emergency department impact patient experience, this looks like there's a fair bit of alignment going on here. And we see here that they're looking at some examples here of how one thing might constrain the work, that there's some legal limitations here. Okay, So we're going to look at one more thing, and then we're going to go to something that someone brought up in the chat. So I said, you want to check your alignment here. So we've looked at their question, we've looked at their framework. Let's look at their problem statement. And you'll see that this is helpfully labeled here. If we go back to the table of contents, we'll see they actually start out with their problem statement section. And we have a general description here that staffing patterns decline and into the evening. And then there's this legal complication that they're not sure what is this going to do. So the problem is they don't know what to do about this. The framework says, okay, well, here are the things that you pay attention to determine if something is working. And their question is this thing affecting the patient experience? All right, so that's a nice alignment between those three sections. Now, there was a particular question in the chat room involving a course number. And as a faculty member here, I usually have access to these courses to go look at related assignments, and I'm happy to field questions related to that. So for this next example, I'm going to go ahead and bring up a particular course that was being asked about and look at how that is approaching the theoretical framework. So give me just a moment to locate that class. All right, this might not be the exact term, but for our purposes, it should be the same assignment and everything there. So I'm going to go to the assignment section for this class. And I see there is an assignment coming up this weekend about theoretical frameworks. All right, so let's look at this. Using your knowledge of communication theory, discuss the theoretical framework of negotiation in a business or personal communication. All right, so it's saying look at a negotiation and how do you go about deciding what to communicate, what things are important, and to specifically compare two different theories, either of which are candidates for using this and could be potentially combined together here. So if I was looking at this, I would say, okay, I understand the general assignment. How much detail do I need to go into? And what is this going to break down as? And I see our word count here is going to be around 5.5 to 6 pages. Double-spaced page, 12-point font, 1-inch margins like you have with our template, works out to about 250 words a page, which is why I say 5.5 to 6. So it's not a small paper, but also not super long either. Let's take a look at the rubric here. We have the introduction, okay, easy enough. Conclusion, easy enough. And most of this, including most of the points, is going to be the discussion of these two theories. Okay, so this isn't a theoretical framework assignment in the exact sense of the dissertation or DMP project, but it's the same idea of, okay, select something that suggests here's what you should be doing, here's what you should be paying attention to. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fire up Word in another window, and let's build an outline based on this. Just a moment as I get that set up. Okay, you should now be seeing my screen in Microsoft Word. Please let me know if you can't see it or if the text is too small or anything like that. So I've just copied and pasted the instructions here, saying, okay, using your knowledge of communication theory, that's communication theories in general, discuss the theoretical framework of negotiation in a business or personal situation. So the first task is going to be pick a particular situation. If the person who was asking about this wants to volunteer that, I'm happy to use that. Otherwise, I will create an example here. So let us say that, actually, let's use something related to the current situation. If you've ever dealt with contract law or signed a contract, you might be familiar with something called the force majeure clause, which is basically, if there's an act of God, we don't need to do with this. Up, the house was struck by lightning. No, I don't need to host the party. That is beyond our control, kind of thing. So let us say, for the sake of this example, that what we have here is a negotiation about contract penalties due to something that wasn't delivered due to the coronavirus. So we need to identify two theories that we think would be relevant to this and that would explain how things are going on here. I'm just going to take a quick peek in Canvas to make sure I haven't missed anything about this assignment. And let's I'm going to go with a couple examples here. All right, so one of the theories that I'm going to say we're using here is called agenda setting theory. Now, agenda setting theory is one of those things that basically says, okay, what the media tells you is what people care about. So if you are applying agenda setting theory, you're usually saying, okay, someone else is making a big deal of this, but here's what we care about. You're saying, okay, past communications, let's use this lens and realize that's not actually what we want here. So that'll be our theory number one. And then our second one here, well, let's go with the suggested example here, which will be the narrative paradigm theory. Now, in this case, don't take any of these examples that I give you as, oh, this is a source that you can cite. These are just examples that I'm making up on the spot to go with some particular theories. Really quick Reader's Digest version of narrative paradigm theory. So it's a communication theory that was specifically developed to deal with 20th century communication. So, stuff in the age of radio and television and email. And it says all meaningful communication occurs via how we talk about events. You'll see some versions of it that emphasize talking about this as storytelling and others that say reporting. But one of the key parts of it is that creating a narrative, creating a sense of this is how it began and this is how we got to this point is an important thing for making sense, and also in negotiations for arriving at agreement. So let's say here that our situation did not have a force majeure clause. So this could involve major money. Let's say that this is going to be a potential $20 million penalty. Have some stakes here. So how would we go about it? Well, first we'd need to introduce the scenario that we're discussing. So on our outline here, Okay, and then so this is not going to be huge. Remember that outline that we had here, it gave something like 5.5 times more points to the discussion of each theory section than it did to the introduction. So this introduction is probably just going to be 1 or 2 paragraphs here. And the theory 1 is probably going to be around 2 pages. Same thing with theory 2. Now, what I'm typing out here is what we call a developing outline. You start out and see, okay, here's the basic skeleton, and then you fill in details here. And so we know if we're going to have this kind of breakdown for theory 1, well, we should have all those same sections for theory 2 as well. Now, let's say that we look at this and say, all right, well, one of these theories is more applicable or more helpful to the situation than the other. That's fine. Doesn't matter whether it's theory 1 or 2, which order we bring it up. What matters is that we clarify to the reader what you're picking and why. There are some situations where you might be using more than one, in which case say why, which is probably going to be, well, this is helpful for this thing and this for the others, and they're not opposing. They can be combined without problems. So let's say for narrative paradigm theory, let's say that's our theory number 1 here. Well, we're going to need our citations about it and various details. But when we're going to this situation here, well, this is probably going to be the larger part of it, at least a page. And so we might break that down into into additional paragraphs. Say, okay, well, narrative paradigm theory, because it's important to things, and let's say, whatever your breakdown should be. Now, these details that you choose, the ones that you focus on, will depend on how you are seeing that theory being applied to the situation. And one of the foci of the narrative paradigm theory is that people get to choose the story that they want to have. And one way you could spin that in negotiation is saying, this could be a terrible thing, or this could be how we both come out ahead. Let's work towards that. And you'll see people using that kind of argument. And it's something that a lot of people get on board with, which is one of the reasons why narrative paradigm theory is a really powerful thing in negotiations. If you can agree on what the narrative is, and it's not something terrible was done, it's about, we have an opportunity here, it's a lot easier to move forward positively. Now, depending on who the parties are, it might not work for them, because as one of the precepts of the narrative paradigm is that this is a rational choice. If you're trying to do this in a divorce negotiation, it might not work because people get very emotional in divorce proceedings. One of the reasons why they tend to be very expensive. So you might say, this has all these things that are good for it, but because of details about the situation, it is ultimately not the best choice. It could even be not the best choice because you tried that already and it didn't work with them. Depending on the case that you are introducing, there might be details like that, in which case it would be helpful to introduce those details in the introduction section. So then when you come back to them in the detailed theory area, it's not a surprise to the reader wondering, where did that come from? That is probably a good pausing point for here. So let me ask, are there any things that we've talked about today that you would like to see more detail on, or that you have any questions on before we pause for the evening? Great. Well, if there are no questions, we're going to stop here. If you joined us part of the way through, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the recording from this session, and I'm going to send it out to everyone who RSVP'd for this and for everyone who messaged me their email address in the chat window. So thank you very much for coming, everyone. Have a good evening.